Hello, my name is Douglas Kelmer, and I'm president of the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monument Sites, or ICMOS USA, and also president of our supporting nonprofit, World Heritage USA. Today, April 18, 2025, is World Heritage Day. In observation of this, we are presenting this webinar, and the webinar is entitled Heritage Under Threat from Disaster and Conflicts, Preparedness and Learning. So every 3 years, ICMOS prepares a scientific plan that is intended to address what we foresee as the most pressing heritage concerns. In the recent past, the world has suffered from any number of destructive events that are associated with ever-increasing localized conflicts and with global climate change. In California, for the past few years, there have been devastating fires. They were covered prominently by our news media, and we've also had the disaster at Lahaina. We are also somewhat aware of the many fires and torrential rains in the Mediterranean area. But there are even more destructive events not covered well by our news outlets, including intense fires in Australia, which just get worse every year. And in Brazil, there was recently, for the most recent General Assembly, there are increasingly frequent fires and floods of intensities they haven't seen before. But along with these natural disasters, we have seen conflicts that have damaged or destroyed heritage sites. Aggressors have attempted to alter heritage narratives in ways that benefits themselves. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the war in Ukraine. So with this in mind, the ICMOS Triennial Scientific Plan for the years 24 through 2027, 2024 through 2027 is Disaster and Conflict Resilient Heritage, building a heritage that is resilient to disaster and conflict. So what you will see here today is a part of ICMOS USA's contribution to that plan. And with that, I turn this over to Destry Jarvis, Vice President of our National Committee and supporting nonprofit, and our moderator for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. As Doug said, I'm Destry Jarvis, Vice President of ICMOS USA. I've spent the last 50 years focused on national park conservation, heritage, and in various capacities, including in the National Park Service. But I wanted to begin today talking about the problem for heritage conservation and resilience that the Trump administration's actions to date have begun to cause. Certainly the cutting of vast thousands of federal employees from the public land agencies, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service are going to cause tremendous adverse impacts, not only to public visitation, but to the quality and preservation of the natural and cultural resources on those public lands. And they will be exacerbated by increased likelihood of more intense and widespread fires, for example. The administration's stated intent to establish a new firefighting agency ignores the huge success of the Interagency Fire Center and its extensive and successful coordination among agencies when fires erupt on the lands managed by any agency. They do an exemplary job and should continue to do that. The administration's stated policy that the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management agencies by law, which are multiple use and sustained yield mandated, they're going to cut, it sounds like, all trees that are available to be cut. That is not sustainable and is just a terrible policy that flies in the face of conservation philosophy and will lead to more fires, not fewer fires. The fact that they are proposing to eliminate all the grant funding and research funding for climate resilience that they possibly can, they're certainly proposing to do so, will further exacerbate the extent of impacts, adverse impacts from fires and other natural disasters across the United States. These changes are being fought by us and others, but we're far from successful at this point. All of that said, I don't want to take away from the presentations today in any way, shape, or form. The disasters that we all witnessed in Lahaina, Hawaii, and in Los Angeles speak for themselves. They were out of control for far too long. They were extreme and will be repeated in other places in coming years, in all likelihood, unless changes other than those proposed by the Trump administration are made to deal with the impacts of climate change. So I want to open the webinar today. We'll begin with Denise Antolini. She is a lawyer from Hawaii, Oahu, with 30 years of legal experience. She is a professor of law emeritus at the law school at the University of Hawaii. And she lives in the North Shore community on Oahu. Denise, if you would join us, please, take it away.
Great. Aloha, everyone, and good morning from the North Shore of Oahu. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be part of this seminar. So let me go ahead and start my slides. And that looks okay, I assume. I'm going to bring you to Hawaii and focus in on really how Hawaii is reacting to the Lahaina disaster and all the other disasters that have hit our state. And I'm sure all of you have similar stories. So we'll do some storytelling about Hawaii. I am a member of the Hawaii Climate Advisory Team appointed by the governor. So let me get into that. Governor Green there, you see on the right, established the climate advisory team after the Lahaina wildfires and after the legislative session in order to improve the state's ability to protect lives and communities from future disasters. And at the top there, and if you have been to Hawaii, you know how important the indigenous culture is here and how important it is both in terms of our past, our present, but also our future. So we always try to take stock of indigenous wisdom, and you can read there about the common sense, but the wisdom of thatching your house before the winter comes. So we're taking that to heart. Oops. This is, oh, for some reason, I might have a little puka in my slides here. This is the advisory team structure with the governor appointed 6 of us, local members. Our chair is Chris Benjamin, and the rest of us are all volunteers in various backgrounds. And then we have a good team of consultants. So our job is for the last several months, has been to put together a set of policy recommendations for the state legislature. And really to understand the unique aspects of disaster challenges in Hawaii, to figure out potential policy solutions, to learn from other communities, and to try to really protect Hawaii residents. So our policy recommendations are really forward-looking, and a report was released in January of 2025. And one of the things I'll say as we move forward is that our legislative session started in January 2025. So our recommendations really kind of caught right at the beginning of session. So our key findings are that climate change, changing climate, and climate shocks is what we're really talking about, not so much climate stressors like sea level rise, which of course we all care about, but we're really talking about climate shocks, are increasing the vulnerability to extreme weather risk in Hawaii. And we hired an actuarial firm, Guy Carpenter, who gave us an estimate. It's pretty scary, 14 billion of physical loss in the next decade. And that's a very conservative estimate, doesn't include a lot of different types of losses. So our message to the legislature and other policymakers is we need to act now. So our hope is in changing policy with some very specific funding mechanisms that we can build a resilient Hawaii. So we built a policy framework, starting at the bottom there. The key is the financial commitment, which I'll focus on when we get to the legislative slides. Enhancing the capacity of government, particularly now with the loss of the federal safety net. And then we have three kind of pillars or buckets: the environmental resilience, infrastructure and community resilience, and financial recovery. So where does the legislation stand? Let me kind of just jump right to it. We proposed legislation in all various areas, but 75% of the bills that we asked the governor to introduce haven't survived, and that's normal for Hawaii's legislative session. So currently we have two bills that are alive. One recommends a Hawaii Climate Resilience Fund to fund high priority mitigation projects related to economic development. And the mechanism, which we spent a lot of time recommending different mechanisms, is to tax transient accommodations. So when you all come and visit Hawaii, it would add an extra percentage to your hotel bill. And the idea that the governor charged us with from the very beginning was to not tax Hawaii residents. As you know, the cost of living here is extremely high. People are really struggling, particularly with the recent economic situation. But in general, the idea is to shift the burden to new sources of revenue. And I'll give you a little update on that in a second. And then the second bill, which actually was introduced by the conservation community or through the conservation community, obviously in the legislature, was also an increase in the transient accommodation tax. And the idea was to build a special fund that provided a durable, long-term source of revenue for disaster resilience. And again, not burdening vulnerable communities. So for example, we considered barrel tax on imported oil, but because that is basically regressive, that kind of fell out of the policy discussion. In addition to that, apropos to some of the prior remarks by Destry, Hawaii is the only state in the nation that does not have a state fire marshal, which is kind of shocking. So we're catching up. Last year, the legislature authorized the state fire marshal office, but authorized one position at a very low salary. So the governor has proposed a state fire marshal office with appropriate staffing and a robust budget. And that bill is still alive, which is fantastic. And then in addition, Hawaii is also one of the few states that does not have a physical office presence in Washington, D.C., although we have a lot of tentacles there. And so it's particularly now with the federal landscape, the idea is to put an office there to not just for climate resilience, but to help Hawaii survive. So basically, as previously mentioned, I mean, the federal cuts are really devastating. When we started the legislative session, obviously it was before the Trump administration took office, although we knew it was all coming. But now our state legislators are in a scarcity mindset. And being that Hawaii is so isolated economically and very dependent on imports and imported oil and imported goods, it's a very rough legislative session. We know that's not unique, but it's kind of amplified here. At the same time, the message that we are putting across, and there's PSAs that are going out this week and editorials, the local paper's been amazing, is that when times are rough, we need to invest more in disaster resilience because our most vulnerable communities are going to take a triple whammy. So let me give you a couple of examples, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. We have been, through our consultants, mapping our most socially vulnerable communities. I'm only going to give you examples from a couple islands here, but I want to point out in particular, if you've been to Oahu, I'm sure you've been to Waikiki, you can see some of the red down in that area because we have some very lower income communities down above Waikiki and on the west side of Oahu in particular. These are just some other examples. And then we mapped those vulnerable communities against hazard. So on the left, high wildfire hazard, on the right, high flood hazard. So as a way to convince legislators that Lahaina can repeat and will have a more devastating impact on our most vulnerable communities. So just some more maps there, but we know that the dots don't really represent, risk is everywhere at this point. So the projected losses for Hawaii, and remember, we're a small state with about 1.4 million people, are huge. Lahaina could easily repeat, and particularly when we look at what happened in Los Angeles, we know that the magnitude can amplify very quickly. So again, we're basically trying to ensure essentially with a state funding mechanism against future loss. So what we're asking for is for the legislature to step up, and I'm going to finish here with some kind of off the slide remarks. Our legislature finishes in 1 week from today. I mean, literally from 1 week today, all these bills have to be finalized. And what we've seen happen is everyone's heart is in the right place in terms of building community disaster hubs, strengthening homes from, with hurricane clips, investing in hardening our like highway infrastructure and our physical facilities like electrical stations and our harbors. Everybody's heart is there. But under the current financial situation, of course, the priorities are shifting to the social welfare net. So the irony is that in the face of climate disaster, I don't know if it's an irony, but we know this, people don't calculate the risk in the same way as the immediate kind of impending social and cultural disaster. So we don't quite know what the legislature is going to do. We are very hopeful that a 1% increase in the transit accommodation tax locked into a durable fund will provide environmental stewardship resources for things. And let me just end by giving you some more examples. Fuel reduction. In Lahaina, we know it was a combination of factors that sparked the Lahaina fire. But one of the things that really made it a conflagration was drought conditions caused by, the slow increasing dryness due to climate change. We have a lot of fuel from non-native grasses all over our island due to, in part, from the transition from active agriculture. And then extremely high winds, which we know are more and more frequent. So, and then the wildfire urban interface created, along with the energized power lines and the inability to keep them off and the resparking of the fire. So it was the worst combination of all factors you can imagine. It can happen again. We have those kinds of factors all across the state. So I'll end by saying we are, as the climate advisory team with the governor's urging support and the legislature's support is trying to tackle a big issue. But as my last bullet there points out, we're really prepared for the long haul. Every legislative session, we hope to make progress, even if we can only set the framework this session. But I'll stop there and be happy to take questions, but I hope it gives you a little bit of insight into what we're trying to do in Hawaii to get ahead of the next disaster. Mahalo. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. That was terrific, really informative. We will take questions at the end, and if you have them, you're viewing this webinar, you have questions, put them in the chat, and I'll screen them and ask them from here, but we'll get your questions answered as best we can. Our next presenters are a duo from the Architectural Resources Group, one based in Oregon and one based in Los Angeles. Katie Horak is with the Architectural Resources Group in Los Angeles, and Morgan Cork, who's a historian, architectural historian with the Archaeological Resources Group Architectural Resource Group, sorry, and is a technology specialist with GIS mapping and things of that sort. So Katie, please start off. And again, we will take questions, both Katie and Morgan, as well as Denise, after their presentation. Please, Katie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Destry, for the introduction, and thank you all for the invitation to participate today. It really is an honor to be here, and thank you, Denise, for your presentation. We're still really close to the tragedy in Los Angeles. It was just a few months ago that this occurred, and it's so helpful to speak with colleagues and hear from colleagues who are a little bit further out from their own tragedies and the lessons learned. I just quick anecdotally, about a week after the fires in Los Angeles, I coincidentally had a trip to Sarasota, where I learned so much from Architecture Sarasota about their response to Hurricane Helene and the disaster there. And I'm so grateful to be part of this community who's really working hard to address these issues before they occur. Especially as we are seeing uncertainty with the federal government. So thank you again for including us. And Morgan and I are both really happy to be here to present a documentation project that we undertook after the fires in Los Angeles. And the project consists of 2 interactive maps that documented heritage sites in both the Eaton and the Palisades fire areas. So on the morning of January 7th, multiple fires were burning out of control in Los Angeles. And at that time, we had no idea what the ultimate effect would be on our communities. And when that was happening, many of us here were mobilized by a desire to help our friends and members of the greater Los Angeles family, people both known to us and unknown to us. So as heritage professionals at ARG, our immediate thought was that we could be helpful by using the documentation tools that we use in our daily practice to document the extent of damage and loss of heritage sites in the fire areas as a foundational tool for rebuilding. So we immediately got support from our partners at the LA Conservancy, who would spearhead the project, and the World Monuments Fund through their crisis response program. So the project that Morgan and I are going to present to you today is a result of that effort. So in the next slide, you'll see that Los Angeles is a really big, complicated place. And I know that many of you know the city, and many of you on this call may even be in Los Angeles, but I don't want to assume that everybody knows LA. So I'm just going to briefly describe where the 2 fires were located. So the red boundary represents our city limits. It's sort of big, unwieldy boundary. The city is approximately 470 square miles in size and has an irregular boundary straddled by dozens of other independent municipalities and unincorporated LA County communities. Next slide. The Pacific Palisades is located within Los Angeles city limits at the city's edge on the left where it meets the Pacific Ocean, where Altadena is located outside of city limits in unincorporated county land. So you can see that these communities are very far away from each other and have very different environmental, architectural, urbanistic, and socioeconomic character. So as you can see on the next slide, the first thing that we did when starting our project was assess the presence of pre-existing heritage data in both the Palisades and the Eaton fire areas. So because the Palisades is within the Los Angeles city limits, it had been included in the city's Survey LA project, which was the comprehensive historic resources survey undertaken by the city with support from the Getty from about 2010 to 2020. And on the next slide, it was really thanks to the efforts of that project that recent heritage data for the Palisades exists in the city's Historic Places LA database, including designated resources as well as resources that had been identified as eligible for designation as part of the Survey LA survey. So this is what you see on the screen. This is the Historic Places LA site, and the little orange icons indicate the presence or concentrations of heritage data. However, Altadena, because it's located outside of city limits, had not been included in Survey LA, and it had not been subject to a recent comprehensive heritage survey. So although there have been heritage surveys in Altadena over time, they're either outdated, multiple decades old, or focused on small thematic survey areas. So once we had a good grasp on the existing data sets, our goal was to map to the greatest extent possible all of the heritage data in the burn areas and to reconcile this with data being compiled by the city and the county of Los Angeles to document fire damage to all structures in the fire areas. And our hope was that the map could provide a clearinghouse of all heritage and fire damage data so that anyone in the public could go online, search for a property, see the pre-fire condition, the post-fire condition, and any existing heritage data. And we'd hope that this effort would be the first phase of a multi-phase effort that could provide aid to homeowners of heritage sites that have been affected by the fire. So as with any project, particularly those in disaster response where conditions are constantly changing, we have learned a lot in the past 3 months of working on this project. We learned firsthand how critical mapping is as part of first response efforts after a disaster. So immediate place-based data can provide the community and agencies with up-to-date data on conditions without needing to physically visit those areas, which continued to pose environmental dangers. We also learned how useful up-to-date heritage resource survey data is in the case of disaster. One of the original objectives of Survey LA was to provide baseline heritage data that could be useful as part of disaster responses. And I don't know that any of us really understood what that meant until that data was really put to work after the fires in January. Comparing the data of the Palisades with that of Altadena, which was so scarce, really showed how important that type of survey effort is. We also feel really strongly that Altadena needs a comprehensive survey, historic resources survey. And although more than half the community's buildings were lost in the fire, there are many heritage buildings that still remain, and the documentation and preservation of those buildings will continue to be even more important as community touchstones during rebuilding efforts. So Morgan is going to jump in and talk a little bit more specifically about the mapping efforts.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, so I'm going to get a little bit more technical, and then if time allows, I'll try to do a walkthrough of some of the maps that we provided or created for the Los Angeles Conservancy. As mentioned, we created these in partnership with the Los Angeles Conservancy to better understand the identified built heritage in these areas and to try to assess the fire's impacts to those resources using publicly accessible data from agencies like CAL FIRE and the Los Angeles County. And I want to acknowledge that the data we've been using to do this work represents incomprehensible loss on a personal scale for entire communities, with each burn area comprising tens of thousands of acres and tens of thousands of structures have been damaged or destroyed. Identifying existing data sources surrounding the built heritage was a critical first step, and these are the primary sources of information for the historic resources in the Palisades fire burn area. And as Katie mentioned, we were extremely fortunate to have access to Survey LA data, which is already georeferenced, and it's tied to a lot of rich attribute information about designated and eligible individual resources and districts within the LA city limits. And then we were also able to geocode data from the Built Environment Resource Directory, which is a state inventory of cultural resources that have been evaluated and processed through the State Historic Preservation Office. And then the Los Angeles County also maintains a geodatabase of historic resources for unincorporated areas. Because of the availability of up-to-date data, particularly through Survey LA and the bird inventory, we can comprehensively look at existing resources in the Palisades fire area that have recently been identified and evaluated for potential historic significance, and then analyze that information against the fire damage data. And access to both of these historic resource data sets and the CAL FIRE damage inspection database allowed us to assess these impacts within a matter of days, which made GIS a particularly important form of documentation when those areas could not be accessed by the general public. But identifying historic resources for the Eaton fire burn area, however, posed a completely different set of challenges, since there has been no formal or comprehensive historic resource survey conducted recently in the area. However, as you can see on the right, the map is rich with information. The data is comprised of more ad hoc sets of sources, most of which are from the community and local organizations like Altadena Heritage, and who actually conducted a community-led survey of Altadena in 1988 and was able to provide their historic data to us as a foundational inventory of resources evaluated by volunteers almost 40 years ago. While a historic resource survey of Altadena's African American community was conducted in 2020, many of the resources on this map have not undergone a formal evaluation, but they are also meaningful to the local community, which has made the map an important repository for the stories and legacies that are pouring in from residents and organizations. And as a result, the map has really taken on a life of its own by way of documenting important heritage sites via the community, and can continue to build upon and improve using that vital input. So again, these two maps represent two very different approaches to the documentation of heritage data. One is more formalized and the other maybe more ad hoc, yet just as important. If anything, the devastation of these wildfires has highlighted the importance of comprehensive and accessible heritage documentation needed before calamities and devastation occur. Our hope is that the areas impacted by the Eaton fire, including the surviving structures within those areas, can undergo a comprehensive survey and assessment that can formally codify the important heritage sites and places that are significant to those communities. So now I'm going to actually walk through these maps. So if you go to the Los Angeles Conservancy website, losangelesconservancy.org, the homepage will lead to the maps here. I have them open already on my screen. And the first is the Palisades fire map. So the orange layer you see here is the burn area. And then anything in green is actually an identified historic resource. You can access a little bit more information on this side. But really, once you start going into the maps and zooming in, you can see that there's going to be these point layers, which comprise of the CAL FIRE damage data. So if you click on a green layer here, a pop-up will come on the side that gives more information about the resource that has been picked up in the Survey LA or the HPLA website. And so you can actually click through and open up the Historic Places LA page for this resource and look at information specific to its designation status, its eligibility, its construction date, its significant statements. Going back to the map, you can also click into Google Street View, which has become a really important way to look at pre-fire imagery of different buildings. And so we're looking at the Friedman House here, which was designed by Richard Neutra, located in the Palisades area. And then going back, if you click actually on the dot, this is unfortunately in so many cases an image of a completely decimated structure. And so there's a little bit of that comparison and understanding of the loss of heritage when you're able to overlay this information. If I go into the Eaton fire map, this map, as I mentioned before, it has a ton of different information because of all of the different sources that poured through the community. Here is a historic district known as Jane's Village. So it's outlined here in green. If I click on any of the resources here in green, it will pull up some of the information. You can actually click through on the bottom left and try to understand the layers of information because there are so many sources that have picked up these different sites. You can understand the different kind of repositories for information, and then again go into Street View and kind of go around. And these are cottages that were designed by a local prominent and prolific architect, E.P. Janes, and they exist throughout all of Altadena, but this is a high concentration of the Janes Village. And so again, anything that is in red is unfortunately a structure that has been damaged more than 50%. You can also type in specific addresses and access information that way. This is the address of a specific business located on Lake Avenue in Altadena. This business was picked up in numerous different sources as an important site for the African American community. This is the UEDF Fish and Chips restaurant. UEDF stands for United Economic Development Fund, which was also a local nonprofit. This was picked up in the African American Historic Resources Survey. It was also a Los Angeles Conservancy legacy business. It was picked up in the 1988 community-led Altadena Heritage Historic Resource Survey. And the thing that's really important about this work is that if you go to Street View and sort of pan over to this building, unlike the Richard Neutra building, this may not become an immediately obvious heritage site to people that are driving by, but it is important to the community. It's important to the African American community, and we need to be documenting these types of sites as a result. And when we look back at the damage imagery, while it's absolutely been destroyed, there's still remnants of that really important site. And so hopefully this is useful information to understand what we can do to honor these legacies, salvage the materials that exist, and try to make decisions about future land use that pertain to the communities and their legacies. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Destry.
Thank you very much, Morgan and Katie. That was an amazing amount of data, for sure. Please, you all in the viewing audience, put your questions in the chat. And if Denise and Morgan and Katie would unmute yourselves and come back on the screen, that could be, we could get on with a couple questions that I can throw out to start with. In both instances, Hawaii and Los Angeles, I mean, you've experienced intense trauma and damage, but the nature of the work you've been doing, not only inventorying the damage of those events, but setting in motion, I think, a process that can be replicated in other places, perhaps before a disaster. And I'm wondering, to what extent can or has the State Historic Preservation Office, for example, been able to get out ahead? I know they're historically underfunded, but is there a way to prioritize vulnerability of other sites? And if so, what's happening in, if you know, in Hawaii or California or elsewhere in the country that can do a better job of preparing for the next one, in whether it's getting inventories done or getting mapping done or taking direct resilience action of the most vulnerable sites in the way of individual structures. I know California has done more than any other state, I think, in earthquake proofing buildings. But there's surely more things to be done. So please, whoever would like to start, if you can speak to that, that would be terrific.
Well, maybe I can start with Hawaii. There has been a tremendous amount of work done post Lahaina to try to reconstruct, but I have to say that to our knowledge, there was, I guess, like, eaten dearth of pre-disaster information. Lahaina, as many people might know or might not know, was the capital of, the Hawaiian Kingdom for a while. Incredibly rich cultural landscape that developed into an equally rich, very diverse, multicultural community. Much more diverse, I think, culturally than people realize as visitors, because most visitors kind of go down the main street and do tourist activities. But the disaster really kind of pulled back the curtain on who really lives in Lahaina and why they're there, and the cultural sites. So and let me just pivot to going forward. There's still a very, very difficult, robust discussion going on about how to rebuild. And I know that's, it's not unique to us, but there is a very strong movement, particularly among the Hawaiian community, to try to recover some of the traditional Hawaiian landscapes and features, including very large, you would call it in Western world wetlands, but we call it something else here. So in a way, that opportunity has presented itself because the landscape has changed so dramatically. So I think people are hopeful, but the issue is, and you mentioned, is the resources for cultural and heritage sites in Hawaii is particularly weak. So the opportunity's there. And I hope we grab it, but we're going to need some outside resources, I think, to do that. And I have to say, by the way, Morgan and Katie, the mapping presentation, unbelievably powerful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Um,
You want to
I
add to
can-
that, Katie?
Sure, yeah. So when, our SHPO is understaffed and underfunded, California is a big state. Um, and I am certain they're having conversations about how, how SHPO involvement, how important that is, and they're preparing for the next one. When we initially did our mapping, when we had this idea, part of our goal was to help provide this data to regulatory agencies, because we know that, first of all, the local jurisdictions, the county and the city, and the SHPO, they're all underfunded. They're all short-staffed, and they can't mobilize funding quickly to do something or staff resources quickly to do something like this. It's usually years of preparation to do something like a survey like this. And so we had hoped that, in the private sector, we could actually quickly and get this done, and then provide this data back to the city and the county and to the SHPO so that they could use it. So we had really good early conversations with the SHPO about how this data could be helpful to them, particularly as, FEMA surveys start to happen, and SHPO concurrence of FEMA findings. So we're still early. I'm not exactly sure how that's all going to work and what's happening with FEMA, but that was certainly a goal, was that the work we were doing could help these public agencies do their work.
Exactly. Anything to add to that, Morgan?
I just keep thinking a little bit about, when there's a lack of funding, but there's a lot of people who have been affected, and a lot of mobilizing on the ground. It's pretty incredible what you can do when everyone is just chipping in. With the case in Altadena, because there wasn't, this funded comprehensive survey beforehand, and there still should be. The amount of information that we were able to collect, thanks to the community and the residents, is such an amazing, it's so foundational to, maybe the more formal funded work that can happen later, if possible. But it's just capturing that information however possible has been really meaningful. Especially when funding opportunities are a little unclear, unknown at the moment. I think there's a lot that people can do on the ground, and that's been demonstrated here.
Great. So one of our observers has a question that acknowledges the fact that all of this starts at the local level, and local governments have to undertake the response. And the questioner wants to know how you begin the process at the local level for advocates or heritage professionals to lobby the local government to do the right thing with comprehensive documentation surveys. And a similar question, I'll just add this one, specific to the state historic preservation offices in Hawaii and California. I mean, have they accessed funds of their own? Have they sought federal funding that can be applied to some of the restoration efforts? And how can people in other states help support success in California and Hawaii, so that when it happens there will be a plan, a process, and some track record? So what do you think about that, Denise, Katie?
Well, maybe I can start with how to support.
That's a good one.
Particularly today, philanthropic support is critical, right? There is a fund through our community foundation in Hawaii Community Foundation. It's called Maui Strong, or Lahaina Strong. There's different names for it, but our Hawaii Community Foundation is kind of a one-stop shop for folks who want to support a variety of efforts. And so I'll just advertise that as a way to funnel money into the state for specific purposes. I don't have enough knowledge about what our state historic preservation office has done, but as Katie and Morgan said, you know, our office is so strapped they can barely keep up with the current flow of development projects, and they just don't even. Sometimes you don't even have the capacity to build capacity, right? So I'm afraid that's where we are. So again, if there have been a lot of outside sources that have helped Lahaina and other areas recover, and we're incredibly grateful. We need more, particularly in the area of culture and heritage.
Yeah. So where does the community foundation itself get its revenue? Is it
From
public funding or donations?
Donations, yeah.
Okay.
And you know, we've got some very wealthy transplants here in Hawaii who have given generously and need to give more. And you know, and as I was saying, you know, going back to my policy slides, we're hoping visitors will contribute to that when they come to Hawaii. I mean, prices are
Sure.
already high. We'll just tack on a little bit, but it's philanthropic foundation. Yeah.
Very good. Katie, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah,
Another question?
sure. I can just say that we're so lucky in Los Angeles to have the Getty as a neighbor and a funder of the Survey LA effort. Comprehensive heritage surveys are very expensive because they are labor intensive. And without the Getty funding, it wouldn't have been possible for the city to fund such an enormous effort. So I would say that that's something unique about our community, that Survey LA was partially privately funded. Um, at the same time, Los Angeles is bigger than most places, and comprehensive surveys don't have to be that big and complicated in other communities. And I would say that just showing the difference between the Altadena documentation and the Palisades documentation is a huge case for a comprehensive survey, because we really, you know, as Morgan said, the data we have in Altadena is really valuable. It's all, a lot of it's community driven, community provided data, but they aren't formal determinations of eligibility that would be useful in like a FEMA process. And that's something that, in speaking with, you know, friends at Architecture Sarasota, they didn't have a comprehensive survey either when Helene hit, and they were needing to go through emergency determinations of eligibility to help owners of historic properties adapt their buildings as historic resources instead of having to bring them up to current code. So I think there's a huge case to be made, just for streamlining processes after disasters hit. I know that it's hard to convince the powers that be to dedicate that kind of money to something when it's for something, you know, that may or may not happen in the future, but certainly in disaster-prone areas, there's a giant case to be made. And finally, I would just say that, you know, our SHPO, and I think most in the country, do offer certified local government grants, and Survey LA did benefit from some CLG grants, and that's, I think, that a comprehensive survey in a smaller community that'd be a great use of CLG funds.
Yeah. One viewer suggests the California State Library Free Emergency Preparedness Service as a source of technical support and maybe money for cultural heritage resource preservation. I don't know a thing about that service, but if those of you in California, Katie, may know about it, I don't. Do you have any thought on that?
We have not tapped into that for this current effort, but thank you for that suggestion. It's great.
Another viewer asks, in the case of Los Angeles, how the GIS information will guide reconstruction, and will there be some consideration given to whether to reconstruct or not? And in doing so, any thought to changing building codes to presumably improve resilience going forward? Any thoughts about that, Katie?
Yeah, I can speak generally about this, and then Morgan, if you have thoughts on this too. You know, we had always hoped that this would be the first phase in a larger multi-phase project, and that this would be foundational data that would then be useful to the LA Conservancy as they might deploy teams of pro bono architects and engineers to go out to these sites and help homeowners who may have an interest in rebuilding or salvaging or shoring. So when we had also hoped that the data could just, and the good thing about GIS is it can continuously be built upon. So we'd also hope that, you know, as maybe other groups are doing more research, we could always add information like historic photographs or even architectural drawings and things like that to specific parcels that could then both be data for interpretation, but also information for anybody who may want to use that information in rebuilding. So I think there are a lot of ideas of how the GIS data can be augmented to help in the future. And there's definitely a lot of talk in LA about how would you adapt these buildings that are so susceptible to fire in these fire areas? How do you adapt them to be more resilient while not impacting their historic character? So those are the very, very important next step conversations that are currently happening here.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
exciting to see what the data might provide in terms of the next steps in rebuilding and in reconstruction. I think the reality is, though, that these wildfires were so devastating that a lot of these buildings, it's just there's nothing there anymore. And so GIS in this case has also really provided this form of documentation of what was, and hopefully it's something that people can look to, and it can inform sort of the bigger picture about what the community legacies are in these areas, and what does that mean when it comes to rebuilding and reconstructing, even if you can't reconstruct that historic site the way that it was or in up to code. It's really important to understand what was there. And how that impacted those specific communities. So I think it's twofold. There's data that can be provided for the reconstruction and the rebuilding, but it's also a documentation of the past.
Yeah, I would just add, you know, on the federal side, there's a federal appropriation account that is managed by the National Park Service called the Historic Preservation Fund. It covers multiple things not related to units of the national park system, but to state and local historic resources. That money was fully appropriated in the current fiscal year, and the Trump administration is in the process of trying to have it rescinded. They have also not submitted their request for fiscal 26, but, and I can say this from personal involvement, every Republican administration since the fund was established has tried to zero it out. Congress has successfully continued its funding and increasing it in several fiscal years. We have no idea where they will go with it this time, and whether the already appropriated funds ultimately through actions in the federal courts will be made available again, or will it disappear? Normally, a rescission takes congressional approval, which they have not been pursuing. So at this point, a lot of that funding has just been stopped, but it hasn't gone away. It's still in the Treasury, and it can be brought out when it's needed or when the administration allows it to be. Time will tell, and efforts will be made to see if that money can be made available for this fiscal year, as well as continuation into next fiscal year. One viewer, Erica Espanola, comments that the Lahaina Restoration Foundation manages many of the buildings that are contributing elements to the National Historic Landmark there. And I'm wondering, I'm not familiar with that foundation, so I'm wondering, Denise, if they are also dependent solely on donations, or do they have another source of revenue, and are they a potential source for some of the remedial actions that are going on there in Lahaina?
I also, I don't know the specifics about that foundation, but my guess is that they desperately need resources because anybody with local connections to Lahaina is just devastated. If they didn't lose their house that they owned, or their rental house, then their friends or family lost their house. An extremely close community. And so even the institutions that were there have been devastated. There was a cultural center that was completely burned down. One of my former students was one of their lawyers. She was living there, complete loss. So I would say that even the foundations that have the mission, or the institutions that have the mission to help, really desperately need help. I did want to return, and this connects to your question, but a little bit to this rebuilding conundrum, particularly for Lahaina, where the waterfront is so historic. And it's right on the waterfront, right on the ocean. So we have this kind of huge conflict with sea level rise, and that shoreline was really, let's say, in poor condition. I don't know if any of you have been there lately, but it's not the kind of broad waterfront, area that it used to be. And so you've got, sea level rise. In Hawaii, we've really changed our policy to prohibit shoreline hardening. Huge change in policy in the last couple of years. You've got that beautiful historic waterfront. But the question is, should that be rebuilt in the same way, as close to the shoreline? Anytime building codes change, which is progressing toward a more resilient infrastructure, we're also really increasing cost and time. And in Hawaii, we have real challenges with just getting materials, right? Particularly, well, I won't mention the T word, but just getting materials to Hawaii, and now increasing costs. So it's a real dilemma. Should things be rebuilt in the same way, or should we rebuild in a new way? And I have to say that the county and the state are still in the midst of that discussion. There's some bills in the legislature about that. Expedite. Do we skip environmental review? Do we skip the cultural impact statement? So I have to say that's still being worked out, but Lahaina really provides an example of a coastal community that was already at risk, that now has some very, very difficult choices ahead.
So we're getting close to the end here. Doug Comer has asked a question, and it's a larger question for areas that are building in the edges of long-established cities, like perhaps Altadena did, that have been built in places that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of fire, maybe the impacts of earthquake and mudslide. But have there been any statewide efforts in either Hawaii or California that would lead to reforms or changes in land use zoning to lessen the amount of development, at least in particularly vulnerable areas, with the fact of these extreme events happening?
It's a really good question. I think those conversations, I would imagine those conversations are happening. I think they should be happening. It seems like just the friends that I know who are grappling with the question of whether to rebuild in a place like Altadena that is obviously so prone to this type of disaster. I think that there's a lot of people aren't going to be able to get homeowners insurance in areas like there may be private issues that keep people from building in places that are more prone to disasters. But I do think, when this initially happened, a lot of us in Los Angeles were talking about, the opportunity that this presents to rethink zoning in these areas that where this could just happen again in a generation. And I do think those conversations are happening. I'm not up enough to report on where they are, but it's, I think, very important conversations to have at the state level, because I think we're seeing, because the Los Angeles fires, it's so kind of crazy that these two fires happened in totally different parts of the city and were both so devastating, but very different parts of the city, one in a city within city limits, one in unincorporated county limits. And now we're kind of seeing how the differences in those communities play out just from a local legislative and sort of the local resources and the political just through the political nature of those places, we're seeing in real time how that's playing, how the differences in those communities and how it's playing out. So I think it's something that will be very interesting to study, I would say, in 5 years, sort of what happens in the rebuilding of these
Right.
areas.
Right.
And maybe you want me to, I'll add quickly about Hawaii. We are far from any restrictions on building, in the way that you suggested. It's so much in disaster recovery mode now. So the most we hope to get, I think, over the next couple of years is fire breaks, which is so fundamental, either brown or green fire breaks. I do want to mention the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, HWMO, is doing fantastic work statewide on all these issues, but it's still in that completely urgent mode, and the politics are not there to restrict building in the wildfire urban interface, just to be blunt about it. So I think that's the right direction to head, but I'm not sure we'll ever get there. We're just still in recovery.
Well, great. I want to thank all three of you for wonderful presentations, very informative. You're very knowledgeable. You've got a lot of work to do ahead of you as well as others in your communities. So I'm going to close this out, and Doug will come back on for the final word. Thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank Destry, who always does an incredible, stellar job in moderating, and I want to thank our speakers as well. I think they've really covered a lot of the important issues that we're going to be facing as we move ahead. And I also want to say that we are forming a task force that will contribute to the Triennial Scientific Plan. So this is the beginning, the webinar that we're having right now. But we're forming a task force that will convey contributions from our national committee, ICMOS USA, and our supporting nonprofit World Heritage USA. We're going to be conveying contributions to the Triennial Scientific Plan, which again is directed at disaster and conflict resilient heritage. And also, obviously, what you've seen today will contribute heavily to that plan. And I want to acknowledge the members of ICMOS USA, World Heritage USA, who've stepped forward to coordinate these contributions. And they include some really incredible, stellar members that we've had in our national committee, namely Stephen Kelly, Ann Jensen, Pamela Jerome, and also John H. Jameson, who chair this task force. So we're very grateful to them that they stepped forward. They're going to be providing, the task force will be providing periodic updates on their activities and contributions. And you're going to see those in our newsletter and on our websites. So we really invite all of you to stay abreast of their activities and to participate as they might suggest. As Destry said, we're at a pivotal moment for heritage preservation. We have a lot of challenges, almost so many that they seem overwhelming, but we will take them one at a time. So please join us in that effort. We need your support and your membership in our organization. We're here to promote and celebrate international and intercultural understanding at a time when our country risks isolation and alienation from the countries around the world. So membership to ICMOS USA and our supporting organization, World Heritage USA, is readily available on our website. Really encourage you to visit our website and join us. We have a lot of work to do. So thank you all for your attention, and we do look forward to working with you. Until we meet again, stay well, and please do stay in touch. Thank you.